Now, onto the airships. As surely as a trek up a mountainside brings attention to one's means of sustenance and survival, so too does a flight to 20,000 feet bring attention as to how one keeps flying and fit. While airship flying has not really taken off in our world, as it has in Kenneth Opel's fiction, there were real-life examples of airships flying as high as 20,000 feet, and they would have had to contend with many of the same technical challenges as portrayed in Kenneth Opel's Skybreaker. The first challenge for an airship to fly so high is that the decreasing air density and pressure. If you inflate an elastic balloon at sea level and let it ascend, before long, it'll expand until its skin breaks from the pressure difference and come back down to Earth in scraps. So too with an airship if, upon ascent, the lifting gas cannot expand its volume inside the envelope, it will exert a pressure on the envelope, and even the airship structure itself. In the range before envelope failure occurs, buoyant lift will also decrease, because the mass of air being displaced is no longer as great as before. And as the lifting gas cannot expand to displace more air at equal pressure, eventually, if the envelope doesn't break apart, the airship will stop climbing. Since it's not desirable to have an airship envelope under pressure and fit to pop, venting gas was a common practice, and in story, a more technologically advanced solution is presented in maintaining empty gas cells for the lift gas to expand into, and in a compressor to store the excess gas safely into pressure tanks. Hopefully, any water ballast uses antifreeze to avoid bursting the tanks and plumbing. If an airship wants to fly higher after that, the only way to keep going is literally to lighten up, to weigh less, or lose ballast. It makes sense then that a skybreaker like Sagarmatha is so relatively small compared to great vessels like Aurora and Hyperion. Since venting helium in real-life airships is an economic pitfall, the blimps and small airships we see today mostly start their flights at an inflation ratio less than 1. That is, when inflated and buoyant, they don't fill the entire body of the airship, so the gas has room to expand as they ascend and maintain the same buoyancy. They're still not big enough to actually carry anything like a salvage operation up to the great heights of 20,000 feet. The real-life examples of such high-flying airships are mainly the S-class German Zeppelins of World War I, modified from the more typical M-class vessels, and accompanied by dedicated height climber R-class airships. They removed one engine of the 6, reduced their defensive armament and part of their bomb capacity so they could fly higher, in hopes of avoiding British anti-air defenses. Most real-life examples of such high-flying aerostats are specialized balloons, carrying instruments for scientific research and study up to the great heights of the stratosphere. At near sea level, you can see their envelopes as skinny and saggy, like a rag unfit to lift off. But at altitude, that little bit of lifting gas inflates the envelope to a full sphere. So just try to imagine carrying the weight of naval guns up to that height. In a vessel about the size of Sagarmatha, there'd be little capacity left for anything else, much less treasure and other booty. We could think then that, indeed, Wrath's Skybreaker was designed only for destruction, like a dedicated gunboat, not pirating, which was indeed Wrath's and Barton's mission. The next challenge is maintaining living conditions for any crew going up to that height. The way our airliners regularly fly so high is that crew and passengers are encased in a pressurized fuselage, where air pressure is maintained closer to sea level, and so is the oxygen and heat needed to be comfortable. How this is done is unique and what I find to be quite ingenious. Some of the compressed air from the turbine engines is drawn away before combustion and cooled down using an air cycle device that exchanges heat from the compressed bleed air to the ambient cold air, while also drawing out excess water before being fed into the cabin. This makes high-altitude flight and all its benefits safe for everyday long-distance travel. For an airship to travel at such heights, crew and passenger comfort would have to be achieved another way. Notwithstanding that turbine engines don't yet exist in Kenneth Opel's Airborne world, for airships, pressurizing the cabin would work just like it does in real life, but it would take either a dedicated motor or a portion of power from the existing power plants, which would have to continuously operate to maintain that pressure. A pressurized cabin is also a weight penalty, because it's not just the structure, it's the structure plus its structural reinforcement and the mass of high-density air being taken aloft that needs to be accounted for. The alternative would indeed be, as shown in story, a flight profile that slowly increases the height so that passengers and crew acclimatize to the thinner air. In the World War I height climber Zeppelins, aircrew consistently used tanked air to better breathe and operate at high altitudes. For passengers, it might be a hard sell to try and wear those the entire airship flight, and not everyone would be healthy enough to acclimatize well in the thin air. Without passengers, aircrew could get away with shifts, using tanked air on duty and recuperating in a pressurized cabin section off duty, depending on the airship layout, shift schedule, and the work being done. It's a question for aviation medicine to consider, that's for sure, if ever any large number of people wish to fly airships into the stratosphere. Which brings us to our final technical challenge: what power plants would work in the thin air? In story, as in real life, without dedicated design parameters, internal combustion engines would indeed be starved for oxygen as they go higher. In fact, when you look at an aircraft specification for service ceiling or absolute ceiling, it's the height where there's only enough engine power to give the aircraft a climb rate of 100 feet per minute, or none at all, respectively. So the power of combustion engines decreases with altitude and lower air density. To extend that height, air compressors, in the form of mechanical superchargers or exhaust-driven turbochargers, increase the density of the intake air, at least closer to sea level, and thus help maintain power at higher altitude, exactly as described in the story. In fact, the Sagarmatha's pressurized engine cars likely use turbo or superchargers to intake outside air to directly pressurize the whole cars, not just the intake air. Although, if the crew is operating unpressurized, I'm not sure why the cars couldn't be unpressurized, with the engine still benefiting. Superchargers and turbochargers are likewise rated for their critical altitude, under which they maintain their engine's rated power, and above which they then start losing power, unable to compensate for the altitude. In real life, the natural extension of turbochargers are indeed turbine engines. Whether turboprop or turbojet or turbofan, the design of the turbine engine, when accounting for airspeed, engine speed, and altitude, can maintain thrust up to higher altitudes, where an equivalent piston engine would be left starved for power. Of course, turbine engines can't go up forever, even they will eventually lose power, so the aircraft they're attached to can't climb any higher. Alas, the design of the compressor stage for maintaining combustion and thrust is what allows turbine engines to take aircraft far higher than ever, before alternative propulsion, like ramjets and rockets, come into consideration. Indeed, for airships, alternative propulsion is and should indeed be a viable option. Propulsive engines don't specifically have to be internal combustion types, they can be electric. Indeed, Grunel's Prometheus engine in story is well suited to providing electricity for electric motors to drive propellers for airships. In some ways, electric power and electrical energy storage can be uniquely useful for airships. The weight dedicated to batteries or fuel cells doesn't usually change with the charging and discharging of current, meaning ballast and venting doesn't have to compensate for an airship starting heavy and becoming light over the course of a flight. Electric motors can also be very efficient at turning electric power into torque for propellers, and that power can be finely controlled and distributed between multiple such motors at different positions on the airship. Imagine the fine control needed, and now common, on quadcopters and multicopters created in recent years to illustrate. Especially at high altitudes, modern airships could, hopefully, in the future, take advantage of sunlight unimpeded by cloud cover to collect energy using solar panels, even the type that can be integrated into flexible envelopes. If airship operations become proficient enough to also collect water from the atmosphere, clouds and all, then like the Prometheus engine, power and water can be converted into hydrogen and oxygen. Either hydrogen is used for lift and oxygen used for breathing, or storing them can allow their recombination later in a fuel cell, which generates power, heat, and water again, all of which can be used. The combination of solar energy collection and hydrogen fuel cell in an airship is basically the closest we could now come to a city in the sky, or near infinite flight time for such a vessel, barring sustenance for the people on board. Which brings us to the question, posed so elegantly in a certain song, "Oh, tell me why do we build castles in the sky?" Well, first of all, we don't. Not yet, anyway. Apart from long-distance flights at high altitude, there's very little experience for maintaining habitation or even brief human accommodation up at high altitude, free from the ground and the infrastructure needed for independent living. What measures are taken during long-distance flights could not support a person, or likely many persons, beyond the individual flight. The closest experience we do have is how we support people living up in orbit, mainly the International Space Station. Up in orbit, people have to maintain their health in particular ways, as well as compartmentalize, literally, what they intake, food, water, and their waste, as you do. After all, there's no internal plumbing that makes use of a water, electricity, and wastewater infrastructure to connect to in space, so everything has to be separately packaged and contained until the next cargo or passenger capsule comes to bring in new supplies and take off the waste that can't be safely dumped overboard. As for how the International Space Station could represent life in an airborne city, much of what the astronauts do, by nature of their physical isolation, involves work like scientific experimentation and observation for research, educational programs, and working spacecraft systems. If an airborne city would be judged by its usefulness independent of the surface, then we might consider a flying city that's able to take advantage of its mobility and isolation from the ground. There's some possibilities to imagine. Manufacturing, where materials and parts come in and complete products go out. Farming, where seeds and nutrients come in, and water and sunlight are gathered in flight to grow, harvest, and then ship out crops. Storage, where materials and products can be stored safe from adverse conditions on the ground, and ideally also protected from adverse weather. As a public or commercial space, where people may commute or travel to for work or pleasure, in relation to other nearby population centers, with the flexibility to essentially follow the demand. Imagine if an international event like the Olympics or the World Cup were served by a dedicated airborne city. Or as a way station for refueling, servicing, or repairing aircraft and air vessels on a transportation route or hub, and possibly as a dedicated residence, where the people living aboard are free to come and go, depending only on how far they can fly and still come back safely. To understand the type and scale of systems an airborne city would need to support humans living aloft, we would best be informed by the kinds of systems used on real-life cruise ships. The systems for water distribution, electricity, waste collection and treatment, and the numbers of people they can serve would match well onto the requirements of a flying city, as cruise ships are designed, in many ways, as floating cities. Likewise, the ability of people to move about on board while avoiding congestion or similar traffic jams would call upon the skills and knowledge of architecture, even naval architecture, to design the spaces and corridors needed to support the people's day-to-day living. Before any consideration can be given to a flying city's larger role in human society, the ability to support basic living would be the engineers, architects, and technicians' first concern. In addition to the idea of a wondrous city in the sky, part of the appeal to fantasy in this story is the idea of personal flight. Not simply owning and operating your own individual aircraft, or having access to aircraft in flight by proxy, but of taking something that transforms you into a person capable of flight in and of yourself. Just as Matt in the story put on a leopard skin and then became the leopard, so too did he don a suit of wings and feathers and could fly as he's always dreamed. Or at least glide relatively well. Apart from the fantasy, the technical side of personal flight is fascinating as well. As you could probably guess, we humans can't fly the way birds can. To summarize a long scientific explanation, humans don't have the muscle distribution nor strength-to-weight ratio to fly the way birds can. What people can use to fly, however, is best represented by the design of hang gliders and wingsuits. With the proper wing shape, training, and wind conditions, people using hang gliders can fly proficiently and land back on Earth safely. Using wingsuits is distinctly different, as the closeness of the aerodynamics to the wearer's body means that they must exercise far more precise control in order to maintain safe, controlled flight, and a parachute is still needed for the final landing. In the story, the wingsuit Matt dons is described as a greater span than his arms, and if one wanted to fly for longer and fall slower, this would make some intuitive sense. The technical challenge to using a wingsuit with a wingspan greater than armspan is that we don't have the chest muscles to hold our weight just by holding our arms level. Imagine holding up your body weight by just your hands gripping bars while completely outstretched. But Matt's flight isn't a pure fiction because, as described in story, the wingsuit seems to have a structural member that supports the force of the wing's lift, preventing them from bending backwards and breaking Matt's arms and shoulders. I personally would like to think that someday we too could make wingsuits that more closely match our proportions for hang gliders to extend our flight time, or that hang gliders could more closely mold to our bodies in flight, increasing our tactile interaction with the air itself. In real life, though, we have another means of personal flight that doesn't require either a glider nor a suit, but first, a balloon. The French Aeroplume is an indoor activity program where participants are strapped onto a balloon, ballasted for neutral buoyancy, and given arm-mounted wings to propel and steer themselves as they float and fly inside an airship hangar. Naturally, it can't be used outdoors, as the person flying couldn't fight any wind on their own, and there's no extra buoyancy to support anything more than the person flying. Still, it is one way to get closer to a feeling like free flying, even if only technically indoors. Another fascinating fantasy of flight presented in story comes in the form of the ornithopters that are pedal-driven, just like a bicycle. There are actually numerous examples of real-life aircraft that are human-powered, and also ornithopter at the same time. More often than not, these are conceived as part of competition and attempts at record-setting flights, as the people pedaling and flying are in their best possible physical condition in order to pull off the feats. It's a far cry from the fantasy of being able to pedal your way to a flying good time the way you would your own personal bicycle. Even the characters in the story would struggle to maintain flight without the fatigue of their adventure weighing them down. Still, it speaks to a childhood fantasy that even I had, that if I could imagine pedaling a flying machine just like my bicycle, then it would be gloriously possible. After getting older and learning to understand myself, my limitations, and the real engineering challenges involved in such an endeavor as personal flight, I still hold out hope that the science and engineering of flight will advance to the point that someone in the future may be able to get on the equivalent of a flying bicycle and take off for a ride. Otherwise, I'm still content to look on this particular fantasy and appreciate its beauty, its improbability making it even more so. To close out on Skybreaker, I'd like to declare that rereading this book has convinced me that this is one of my favorite stories I've ever read. Not only are the characters and world so alive and multidimensional when a reader knows where to look, but so too are the beats and turns of the story. It goes from a simple treasure hunt to encounter with seemingly mythical sky beasts, to a ghost story of a revenant ship and lost crew, to yet another pirate survival adventure where the characters we follow have to grapple with what they ultimately want. From sky-dwelling Arizoans presented with the power of godly fire that is stolen by a great man's Prometheus engine, to the symmetry of beginning events paired with a surprising payday by story's end, all the while containing the internal journey of a sympathetic character coming to terms with who and what they want to be. Kenneth Opel's Skybreaker is, in this reader's opinion, a bona fide masterpiece. Now, if you think Matt and Kate can't get any higher in their adventures, just wait until we get to the final book of their trilogy, when they literally reach for their stars, in Kenneth Opel's Star Climber. For our next story, we return to a world at war, where warlike beasts and beastly war machines threaten humanity as we follow airshipman Darren Sharp and noble heir Alexander as they sail on the airship Leviathan and face challenges, not only to survive the first war to end all wars, but maybe in some small way to stem the tide. Next time, it's Scott Westerfeld's Behemoth.